So I'm going to start where I always start, and that's identifying my rough position of my eye line. And as usual, I want to avoid a 50-50 horizontal divide. So, avoid putting your eye line there because that's more or less 50% horizontal split. Sometimes the eye line can be on the 50 on the central measurement, um, but as long as the shapes that you make give you the impression that the main sort of shape is lower or higher than that. But in this case, it's unlikely to be higher because we're sort of looking out to sea and everything's very flat. So I'm just going to pencil in, and I'll pencil this in a bit harder because I know from last week's comments, some of you couldn't see the pencil drawing. And in all fairness, I can't do much about it other than sort of do as I'm doing now, and that's drawing a little bit heavier, which I wouldn't recommend. Okay, this is way heavier than I should be putting the pencil work in. It's just so that you can see it. And I'm just following my beach on the right hand side here. This is the Nevern estuary down in West Wales in Newport, Pembrokeshire. And this little river here, as it meanders, is the River Nevern. Absolutely beautiful area. So we've just got a little mass of land, a slither back there. And what I'm aiming to do today, because it's silhouette, I want to keep the river as a reflection of the sky. So it's going to be light. So well, I'll talk more about the washes in a moment, but you want to keep this as light as possible. So on this side, we've got this sort of shape. And I want to try and make a contrast between this week's demonstration and last week's demonstration. You probably heard me mention quite a few times last week, and if you've watched the video since, how difficult it is to keep some type of scenes loose. Certain scenes lend themselves uh, more to one or the other style. In other words, certain scenes will look better if they're painted in the loose style. Other scenes can be quite difficult to paint in the loose style. And this is probably behind my dislike for things like sunsets and sunrises. It's very difficult to for me anyway, this is just me and my sort of experience. I find it very difficult to paint those type of scenes in the loose style. There's something about them that says, you know, this is a sunset and sunset has to be painted this way. I think it's because you haven't got much tonal value to play with. Your shapes have to be mostly hard edged because you're sort of a bit like today in a way. You're silhouetting shapes a lot. Um, and maybe for reasons at the moment I honestly don't understand. Even as I stand here painting, it still sort of eludes me as to why I find that particular subject difficult to paint in the loose style. But there we go. You'll probably find similar little sort of you know issues in your own work when you paint. Anyway, if you notice there, I don't know whether you can see it very well because I really have penciled them in quite lightly. I don't really want pencil lines in my sky, if I'm honest, but I've just put them in there so you can see. I've just painted in. I get the sense here, if you look at that photo that's in your pack, that you have white cloud in that where my pencil is there, roughly speaking. But the nice thing about it here is that it's just like nearly everything else. It's almost a roadmap to this point here. Do you see what I mean? That pencil sort of points to a spot about here somewhere. Even the river meanders towards that, even if it doesn't point directly to it. you can therefore, and I strongly advise you think about things like this when you're composing your drawing. You decide that there is a vanishing point or a focal point, and things should point towards it. And look how neatly, nature's quite good a lot of the time in providing these these elements for us within our paintings. This little dark cluster of of woodland on the neighboring bank points, the shape of it points in this direction. You can even make this area down here in the bottom left, in a way, in a subtle way, that's almost there, that point there, that almost points to the area too. So use these things to your advantage. It does make it can make the difference between an amateur looking painting and a painting and a professional painting. The amateur paintings, they don't consider these things and use them to their advantage. It's just a bit iggledy piggledy. There's a shape pointing this way, there's a shape going that way. You really sort of need to see the thing as a whole and try to get it to weave a single message, but it all contributes to the same message, that we're really moving towards this place here, this area about here. So not only is that my sort of vanishing point, it's also my focal point. And the focal point, of course, is found if you put two horizontals equally spaced on your paper, two verticals equally spaced, you'll have four intersections about here. Now, the focal point doesn't have to be bang on uh, this intersection on the upper left. It doesn't have to be right on it. It needs to be near it. So I will make sure that this is a dark area here, and this is a light bit of sky, and lots of hard edges around here, softer edges everywhere else. There will be some hard edges elsewhere. Otherwise, it would look rather strange if there wasn't. I think that's all I need to say about this. I hope you can see this drawing this week a bit better. As I say, I've gone a bit heavier with the pencil than I'd like to, but I think that should help you. Um, okay, so and I sort of pre-warn you, this will be a lot of this. The first 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes of this painting are going to be pretty rapid, because it has to be. I think if I slow down, as I probably did last week, I'm not going to get the loose style effect. So here we go. I'm picking up some ultramarine blue with a little bit of cerulean as well. So I'll just show you that. So it was a little bit of ultramarine. If you miss any of this, folks, of course, you've always got the good old video to watch as many times as you like. And you can recap on these mixes and these colors. So there's a strong blue about here, isn't there? Again, I'm sort of tapering it, look, as though it's a sort of abstract arrow coming down here. Now, my cloud is white, and we can all see that, but I'm just going to pick up a little bit of raw sienna, very, very weak. So the edges of those white clouds are going to be warmed up with that raw sienna, something like this. And it doesn't have to be exactly what the photo says. Now, this is quite important. I've delivered two colors already, quite weak, but I'm cleaning the brush and I've got water in this brush. And the intention is here, very, very quickly, land this brush with water in it in the white clean paper where you haven't painted. Don't land it into the paint that you've delivered already. Stay away from there. Land it here and tease up into that area like this. And so I've done this lower part of the sky. I'm cleaning the brush again because it'll have a little bit of paint in it now. And I'm leaving water in it again. And normally I work quicker than this, actually, because edges will go hard very quickly. And you don't want hard edges. You've really got to avoid that transition where two colors like the blue and this raw sienna have a horrible hard edge where they meet, and that's why we have to work fast. So the interesting thing is it always seems fast. I know, if you're not used to it, once you've done it a few times, it it really doesn't. I feel like I'm working really slowly here, to be honest. You get so used to it must be like there must be a good analogy somewhere along the line of regular chores that we do on a daily basis. If we were to do those at a slow, leisurely pace, we'd never get anything done all day. We do things by um, au- automatic. We do things in the sort of frame of mind where you don't think about you putting the kettle. I don't know, putting the kettle on you with one hand, and you might be sort of on the mobile phone on the other. But we do things quickly anyway, naturally. So the sooner you learn to paint this particular section of the painting, because we do slow down later in a moment, but if the sooner we learn to paint these things quickly and assign them to that, it's more muscle memory, if anything, the better. So there's my water. Remember, I said keep this as pale as possible. I may just take out some of this blue there, so it barely registers now. I think I'm okay with that sky. There is nearly evidence here of me not being quick enough because I'm talking and painting at the same time, so I am slower than normal. But there is nearly some hard edges as a result of me taking a little bit longer than I should. You will find some sort of hard edges. If you look at the watercolors of people like Edward Seago, Edward Wesson, and numerous others who've watercolorists who've gone before us, you'll see some deliberate hard edges. There's I think Seago in particular, Edward Seago. If you look at his skies, his watercolor skies, I think he just uses a whopping great mop brush like this, perhaps even bigger, and he's quite happy leaving hard edges. But that in itself is a skill. And you can count his brush marks. Some of his best skies, I've sat there with my book of his work, and I've thought, my God, that is just three, four brush strokes. And what you got to bear in mind, a brush stroke, once it's made contact with the paper, can move about. So you might be thinking, well, that's one, two, three. Yeah, that's multiple brush strokes. Now, if you land on the paper and don't take the brush off and make your shape, you can make as many movements with that brush as you like. Where it goes wrong for us is if we keep picking up more paint, making a new shape, pick up more paint, make a new shape, pick up more paint, make a new shape. That's overworking. But the idea should be always when you're doing these big washes where you want some shapes in those washes is to sort of get the loading of the brush correct, i.e. the water ratio to paint ratio, and once you know it's nice and heavy and it's fully loaded, once you've made contact with that paper, is to not think like I have to do a single directional stroke. No, that's not the case. You can land that brush, move it around, and keep as long as you keep you as long as you keep contact with the surface of the paper, then you can really move that brush around to get your shapes. Okay. Um, Now, as I say, there's going to be a lot of monochrome sort of effects, very monochromatic um, work in this. So I'm picking up the same two colors, ultramarine blue and cerulean blue here. So it gives the blue a slight greenish tint, but I'm looking at this foreground sort of muddy, sandy riverbank. Tide's obviously gone out. Um, so it needs a bit of red. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of alizarin crimson. I mean a little bit because we all know how potent that color is, how the saturation value of that color is very high. So I'm being very careful not to pick up too much of it. But I also then picked up a little bit of burnt sienna just to warm it up a little bit. I suppose if I had to describe this color, and it won't convey terribly well on a screen anyway, folks, but I can describe it to you and show it to you. It was the ultramarine blue, bit of cerulean blue, little bit of that alizarin crimson, and I mean a little bit. And then what I look for really is a plummy color. And what will give me the plummy color is a small amount of burnt sienna. Okay. That just takes it into a sort of warm purple. Now we'll see how that goes. So remember what I said just a moment ago? This is a fully loaded brush. I can feel by the weight of it. Okay. Um, if you get used to using one brush a lot, particularly the bigger brushes, it doesn't matter quite so much with the smaller brushes. But when you're working with a big brush, choose your favorite and stick with it for a while. Get to know it like it's an extension of your hand. And I mean, get to know it so well. You know whether it's half loaded, quarter loaded, completely, empty, and or fully loaded. Whenever you're doing these big washes, you should always start with a fully loaded brush, and you can feel it in the weight. So I land. So as I said a moment ago about the sky, once you've made contact, you can move it around as much as you like. Okay, until it runs out, maybe, but that could be quite good for this area here. So so now I'm taking the brush off the surface for the first time. I'm going to pick up a tiny bit of water, warm it up further. So that means a little bit of extra burnt sienna and a little bit of extra alizarin crimson. And watch this. I do land in the paint that I've already delivered, and I'm moving this around without taking the brush off the paper, without off the surface of the paper. Just took it off then momentarily. So just moving around. I'm just moving this warmer color to places where I want to see it. Now then, this is a hard edge where my finger is, where the white paper. I haven't been there yet, and I want to go into there, not with another color, but with a brush with water in it. So I've just cleared the brush, and here's the brush with water in it quite quickly, because otherwise I'm going to end up with hard edges there. And this is an area I want to be much paler. Because if you study your photo, that's what's happening. So there it is there, and the point of the brush can just help to thin out. Now I'm hoping this more watery delivery above this paint that I delivered, stronger paint, will make patterns at the edge, because what's happening is you're getting a bit of paint that was previously delivered that's just getting happy about sinking into the paper, so it's going to stay there mostly, whereas the newcomer, the new delivery of just water, is just having a little battle at the edge. Okay, it's having a battle between the water, the pure water, and the paint that sat on the surface. And that's always good for this type of texture. You can use it on tree trunks, big trees in your paintings. If you're doing a close-up tree trunk, it's a similar type sort of technique. So all I need to do now, as I say, I'm working pretty slowly. All I need to do now is go elsewhere with this color mix. So I think we've got something similar, and that would make sense. We've got something similar on the opposite bank, though it won't be quite as. Well, actually, it looks quite dark over there. So let's stick with what the photo says for a moment, and if it doesn't work, then I'll be quick to lift some paint off. So I'll start with the same mix. I won't repeat myself. The same mix as I had down here, and in it goes over here. One brush stroke there. Look, okay, one single brush stroke. The brush has made the shape for you. If you look, if you match that shape of that tip of that brush, that's the pointed end of that little bit of sandy bank, muddy sandy bank. So if you just land there, you've made that shape already. So why fuss about with a tiny little brush or point of a brush trying to make a point? If you did, you'd make an awful mess, because you'd be spending too much time making too many brush marks there. But that single delivery from that point of the brush, squashing the brush, pressing the brush down, opens the size of the brush out like this. And by the time you're down here, that brush, because it's pressed down, is much wider, because you're pressing down and flattening it out. I've just got some little, I wouldn't normally be doing that. That's why that's happened. So there we are. Now you could, even though this is mostly what we say monochromatic, we could just jazz that up with a tiny bit, just here, because it's fairly close to us, while it's still wet, with a little bit of raw sienna, which I just picked up on the brush. Okay, so let that. Did you see that? That was just a miniature version of the first shape. I just held the brush there, kept the brush in contact with the paper, and slid the brush to the right hand side. Okay. Economy of brushwork. It's always about that. Now then, I'm looking at, there is some green in this field over here that comes down towards the sea. Excuse me. But it's a greeny yellow. And if I want to keep the If I do want to keep, sorry, the silhouette, the low light situation, I'm not sure whether even that much green showing is going to indicate the conditions that I want to. I think we'll grey it down a bit. So I've picked up the raw sienna, as I, same color as I use for that bit there. But I'm putting a bit more of the ultramarine blue in there. So it won't be quite as green as our photo says. And I'm gonna just use the same brush stroke, with the exception I'm gonna come back to the point of this little headland, because if I want to copy my photo, I think I regretted putting that. If I'm perfectly honest with you, last week, folks, I regretted putting that church steeple in there. I know it's Cardiff and that's a landmark, but I almost knew the second I thought of doing it. It's so tiny in the overall scale of everything. Um, it was going to be different. Even if you put it in at that scale, most people will think you've gone wrong with the brush. So I have got a similar situation here, but I'll just indicate. So here's the same brush stroke as I made for that bit there. Okay, while I'm about it, with the point of the brush, I could just indicate a slightly darker edge on this near bank, and I'm just making contact gently with that same color. So, as I said, the headland does have a sort of a bit of detail to it, but I think it's a flat color, isn't it? Which is good because this is silhouette; it should be flat. But even flat colors need a little variation. So I've just picked up a little bit of alizarin crimson, small amount, and that should darken this area a little bit. Back here, there seems to be some trees. So I'm thinking more about the tonal exchanges in these shapes than the colors of them. I'm not bothered that the color I've got is a bit red and the color in the photo just looks like a darker green. It doesn't bother me at all. Um, it's the tonal value that I want. And if all else fails towards the end of the painting, um, you can glaze over areas as well. So if that doesn't look adequately in silhouette in the particular light that I want, I will glaze over it. Okay, let's turn our attention now to this side. Before I do, I'm just as we speak, as I'm speaking, sorry, I think I'm just going to play with the surface area of this sandy bank over here, and I'm just gonna this brush now has got nothing in it really, other than a little bit of small amount of water. I think the top area there could be lifted. There's just a little bit of fine tuning, and then there's little gaps sort of in this warmer color area there. These are very subtle things to do. Could continue that bit of warmth a little bit further on. They're just seeing that as a bit sort of a little bit flat. Now, in stage 2 or 3, what we'll be able to do is delineate the edges of this particular shape, the bank on the opposite side, a bit more with a few extra darks. They're probably things like boulders and stones that are just sort of breaching the surface of the water. But anything, really, what they're doing is just there will be a dark mark that helps us read this painting and read the fact that this is a sandy area meeting water. Okay, I'm going to move. I'm going to do this much quicker over here because all I'm doing is the same as I did on this side. So it'll be a ultramarine blue. Could take a little bit of phthalo green. It's on the list, but it's there as a standby, if you like. If I suddenly found myself struggling for some reason to get a good green from the ultramarine blue and the raw sienna, I would simply just dive straight into my phthalo green or viridian green, whichever it is you've got. But for the moment, I'm picking up ultramarine blue, raw sienna, and the second the raw sienna goes into that ultramarine blue, you instantly see a very warm green. So here we go. Remember, it's a big shape. We're still dealing with the big shapes here, okay? I've got some leaching um, of color. Now, some of this, some of that is fine, but before it gets a chance to develop too far into the sky, I'm just pushing down. It's almost like you're stemming a cut. You don't want to wipe. You certainly don't want to be scrubbing to get that paint off. You just press down. You can even hold it there for a little while. And there, it's gone. You know, you've curbed. You've stopped that cauliflower developing off that shape. It's there's a little bit up here too, but I don't mind it up there. It's very subtle. It's almost as though it's part of the sky. Right, so into here. Now that's very cold green straight away. So now's my opportunity to do something about it. It should be a bit warmer. I'm actually going to put a little bit of burnt sienna in this time. That's burnt sienna, not raw sienna. Um, and that will just warm it up. And I'm going to use this is a slightly different technique, or again, I'm landing the brush here, and it's fully loaded, and I'm making the edge. I'm just getting some ideas from the photo. I prefer to make my own, if I'm perfectly honest. Just making a broken edge here, and it comes down, it cascades down here. I'm working left-handed so you can see the point of the brush, and we push the point of the brush and make the shape here. I mean, this is the beauty, although there's a 1 inch flat brush on the list today, this is the beauty of a mop brush. They hold an enormous amount of paint. And there's one thing you want to try and do is keep the continuity going. If you had a brush that didn't hold as much, I'd be back and forth reloading the brush every couple of seconds. Right, I am reloading now. And we get a bit darker in here. I'm just going to speed up a little bit here. So I darken that up with a little bit of neutral tint because that's a quick get out. But as long as the idea is this, you don't you don't leave anything one color. I wouldn't have left it that green that I started with, but it's always good to start with a clean color and sully them and change them as you go. Don't try to mix the ultimate color, the finishing color, and think that that's all you need to do. You know, job done. I've made a nice green. It'll make that entire shape. It won't. The shape really has to be broken with different colors, and they must be the right correct tonal value. Now then, I like what I see in the photo here. This brush might be a little bit too big. Oh, no, there you go. Look, just off the point of that brush, tiny, just about making contact with that. We've got to draw our little boat in, which is a bit of an afterthought, to be honest, but we'll do that towards the end. Um, so let's continue with the big shape. I'm just getting a little bit carried ahead of myself, and I shouldn't. Uh, Back into ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, a bit of viridian. And here's this shape that comes in from bottom corner. Look how rich and dark that is. Now that might be too dark, you know. So you got to be a bit careful. So I'm putting all this in as I go, so I can adjust them now while they're all still wet. So is that a little dark? You got to remember that watercolor dries out, pales off, lightens when it dries out, of course. But even so, having said that, uh, you can go too dark sometimes. Now, I don't know whether you noticed where my finger is, I've left a gap. If you look at your photo, there's a gap. Again, I like that because if you complete this part of the story as a wall, there's no way into your painting. This little gap here, I would do the same if this was a stone wall on a farm field. I would make sure that somewhere on that wall that's down here in the foreground, the wall has fallen down, or there's a little stile for people to walk through. You make sure there's a gap. You make sure that um, the story that your viewer is looking at is accessible. You can get in. Right. I'm just looking now to make sure that this area here is dark, because after all, you know, in silhouette, the further, sorry, this area here in particular, I should say, is going to be pretty dark, if not, you know, some of the darkest area of the painting. So that means if this area has to be the darkest and you've already gone darker than that somewhere else, you've got to do something about that. You've got to say, well, I'm going to take some off here, otherwise it's going to be competing with this area up here. So I can make it interesting by color, a little bit of color, which but color doesn't color can be dark or light, remember, okay? Depends on how much water you put in there. Some intense colors, red in particular, cadmium reds, alizarin crimson. The reds are surprisingly dark, so be careful with them when you're controlling your tonal values. Still think that could be a bit darker, as it's as there's areas still competing with it. So the idea is to I'm using neutral tint and burnt sienna, and we'll just with the point of the brush keep feeding it. I can, you probably can't tell it, so I need to tell you. I know exactly what's still wet and what's too dry to work into. I couldn't go back over here, for instance, now because it could be damp, but it's certainly not. It is damp actually, but it's certainly not wet enough for me to change. That would have to be done towards the end of the painting once this area had been given a chance to dry out more fully. So, but these areas are definitely still workable if we're talking about the wet in wet technique, of course, and that's what we mostly use for the moment. So, right at the edge, top edge, I'd like to see uh, a darkness up here. I think that means that somewhere over here we've got to speak. They've got to speak to each other. A little bit of damp. It is still damp, just damp enough there for me to do this. If that was completely dry, I would not have done what I just did because it would be effectively what you're doing is painting wet on dry, and that's going to have a horrible effect because the edges would be too hard. So as we come back here, I can sort of watch this. This has just occurred to me now. Um, I have um, I have a little leg that comes off here, pointing this way. If I pick up that same color and tonal value about here, it's almost though it's pointing to this section of my woodland or whatever it is. I'll just darken that up, and that just continues it continues the movement. I want to texture this a bit more, but like I say, I've done enough texture in wet. Any remaining texture that I require for this area, I think should be done when this area is absolutely dry. So, folks, I think I'm just going to have a check here. I'm probably going to call this the end of stage one. I'm just flicking a little bit of water into some damper areas just to create a little bit of texture. And we will just get some slightly darker textures with the paint and brush here. Long as as long as the darkest, hardest shapes are here, then when we get to stages 2 and 3, we'll be able to further convince our viewer where we need to send them, because this sort of strength of paint will be in small scale through little pebbles and boulders that'll delineate that edge there. So, as I say, I think we'll give this time to dry off of its own accord. I'm just wondering about that. Just soften that a little bit there. Remember, there's a slope. If you're making any marks across this foreground here, this foreground has a lie to it. It has a shallow angle, and so multiple shapes resting on that surface must indicate they must relate to each other and indicate the same slant and slope. It's pretty shallow, to be honest. It's sort of like that. See a sort of slope on that muddy sandy bank, something like this. There we are. Okay, I'm fiddling if I'm not careful. So I'm coming back over to you. We can have a quick questions. What's the time? It's 11:15. So I don't see, that the remaining part of this painting has that much stuff to do. I tell you what I will do. I'm just going to indicate where we'll put a very small boat, and we'll have it sort of slightly up on the mud like this. So let me just show you that shape because it might be difficult for you to see it. So the shape of that boat is basically this. There's the what I call the pointy end. Tapers very rapidly down here and does something like this. You can just see the other side of the hull, the wall of the. So it's like that. Okay, that's what you're looking at there. May have to make some adjustments there because it seems to be its back end seems to be out of the water and that's not right. So I'll drop that down a little bit. That's what I always do. I always just approximate my drawing, and it's funny if you take your eye away from it and busy yourself with something else, and you go back to it, you think, that's wrong. So rather than fixate on it until it's right, the minute you make your first pencil mark, don't do that. Just approximate it, but check it before you decide to paint it. That looks better. But that's the basic shape there. Again, even bigger. There's the front end of the boat. It does something like that. It's a nice curve there. There's the indication of the back end. Does that sort of thing, and we see the opposite side of the little boat, something like that. I'm going to have a bit of a gunnel on it, maybe. So if we put a mast on it, it would be perpendicular to the horizontal that would run through that boat. So just go off something like that. But we'll probably do that with a credit card or something like that. Make life easier for ourselves. Right. Okay. Right. So I'm sort of quite happy with my sky. I think we'll get straight to work now with a smaller brush, and we'll start putting in, if you can call it detail. Certainly refer to the little boat as a bit of detail, but we might also want to sort of break this skyline here a little bit, suggesting, sorry, that there are a few extra branches poking in this direction. Definitely some texture over the foreground now that it's all nice and dry. I didn't even speed dry it because I don't think it needs it. So let's just go at it, and as we go along, I'll explain what I'm doing. So changed here to a small number 4, sorry, round brush. I'm just going to pick up something and see if I can make the right marks. Okay, so here we are. I'm picking up ultramarine blue and some burnt sienna. I'll put a little bit of cerulean blue in here. Basically, I'm looking for a sort of warm, dark color. And I'll start here as though I'm showing what's happening at the edge of the river on the far bank. So some rather irregular shapes, if you like. And do you remember the trick we did last week when we put anything that's floating on the surface of water, particularly when the water is fairly flat and calm? Put a mark in. These could be boulders, they could be they could be birds, ducks, whatever. And then once I've given them a couple of seconds, I'll take a finger and I'll just draw down a little bit of reflection just off those. Now follow the curve of the little sandy bank as it goes around the corner. That's important. Otherwise, it sort of gets lost. You don't notice the curve going back to the right. But make sure that the little marks that you make around there are scaled correctly. So they need to be smaller than the average mark that you make over here, which is closer. Now we won't get much on this bank in that respect because there's obviously a drop, an edge about here somewhere. It drops down to the water, so we wouldn't really expect to find a lot of boulders here, but there's no harm in doing a very gentle sort of line with broken dry brush work like this. Okay, up to the boat, even just to our side of the boat. Now I want more of this stuff here, which I don't know what it is. It's seaweed. I think it is actually. A lot of it is seaweed. So what I'm doing, if you notice, is some of it's a sort of clump of seaweed like this, like a little. I always refer to these things as lozenge shapes. Everything, every incidental little mark I make in my paintings, I refer to as a lozenge shape. It's either a lozenge shape or a line. That's the only two shapes I really need to concern myself with. So this is a lozenge. It's a clump of seaweed. It's a stone, whatever it is. That's a smaller lozenge. That's a smaller lozenge. That's a mid-sized lozenge. There's another lozenge there. But then just off to the side of these lozenges, a line like this. Another line to it, slightly further down the bank. Another line here, a lozenge. Now, if I squeeze this little brush flat like this, I can get a more general texture. So gentle movement like this. Now that's a bit cold, that dark. So I'm going to take a little bit of burnt sienna here, and maybe even a bit of raw sienna. And I'm just loading the brush. You can see the raw sienna on both sides of that. And if I squeeze at the ferrule with my thumb and forefinger, I make, look at that, you can see it, I've flattened it. It's like a paddle. And that will allow me to deliver a dry brush technique like this. Now, I've got a little bird on my shoulder saying, stop, 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 stop. Where are your brakes? Where are your brakes? Um, so I do have to consider that. Now, if I'm making, the only thing I will do, if I'm making that with a warm color like burnt sienna, I've just picked up, cerulean blue, and I've done the same thing. I've squeezed it at the metal ferrule, which gives me a paddle shape, and I'll put some cool over the warm. And if I'm not careful, I really will overwork that. So I think because there's quite a lot of that dry brush there, I'm just going to, with a wet brush, allow some of it to meld together. Just join some of it together, make it look a little more natural in places. I think I've got to go a bit cooler over here. So that means a very watery, it doesn't look watery at the moment. I'm going to take it back off in a moment. That's cerulean blue. Now the water up to this side of our little boat, as though that section there is beyond the boat, and so therefore slightly different in color. A little bit of warmth perhaps in front of the boat. Same thing, quite a strong delivery, but then rapidly weakened with a lot of water once it's delivered. It's that, I have this thing, it's delivery and distribution always. The brush is playing two jobs, is doing two jobs. It delivers the paint before you even decide what you want to do with it. But you do that quite rapidly. Now this is quite different to what's actually in the photo. In the photo, this is a very pale area, whereas my paler area is here. So I'm playing off pale, slightly darker, and that's because I'm building towards putting the boat in. Now then, do we want to put in a similar sort of bit of warmth? Just take some of that off. Do we want to put a little bit of warmth in the river here? Well, if I do, I shouldn't be messing about with a small brush if I'm going to do that. So I'm just going to pick up this scruffy old thing I found in a 20p bargain basket in Hobbycraft many years ago. I'm just picking up a little bit of uh, raw sienna, and I'll just dry brush that weak raw sienna along there in front of us. And again, I'm pretty certain if we were stood there on the day when I took this photo, this is probably more like what you'd see. Photographs, you've got to remember, flatten light passages of your photographs. They flatten lights and they flatten the darkest darks. That's what a camera in my hands does. And I'm not being rude, but I'm sure all of you are better photographers than me. But that's what the camera does in my hand. So, and it is a general rule anyway. Even photographers will admit this. The lights get lightened and flattened, and the darks get darkened and flattened because the camera doesn't cope well with those subtle nuances. So here we are. I'm going to spatter a little bit, I think, now over this foreground. I'm just weighing up how much texture I want in this area. And I'm going to turn to a rigger brush. I'm really just making sure that the boat is the last thing I do. So turn to a rigger brush, same mix, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna. Might put a little bit of cerulean blue in this. And so what's this for? I'm going to sort of say, so push a couple of shapes. By doing this, even though I can't see them in my photo, your photo reproduction probably not much better than mine, to be honest, on your packs. But there is an indication that there's a tree showing some sort of edge to it about here. And I think that'll help break up this, the flatness that's in these big areas. So I'll even come down here a little bit within the envelope of this big shape. And I'm looking for ways of, see if I take a little line down towards the boat, when I get to the boat, that'll help the boat pop out a little bit. Now, a little scumbling of this rigger brush. A scumble, a little lift out, another scumble, another lift out. I think a line from here is important, right across there. That will speak, and then the line back on the opposite bank like that. I've forgotten that little mass of land in the distance, so maybe the rigger brush is just about capable of doing that. It's across there somewhere like that. Not sure how important that is, but I think that's okay. Pretty weak and watery. That was just raw sienna and ultramarine blue. Raw sienna, ultramarine blue. Probably a bias towards the ultramarine blue because the blue will make it further away, make it look further away. When that dries off, it will be paler. So I'll go back to what I was doing a moment ago and trying to show our view exactly what is going on here. I need a bit more line at this edge. You could put a little bit of line on this bank like this. So just if you make note of how I'm painting this is the rigger brush, and I'm holding it like a pencil. So it's staying pretty rigid between my thumb and fingers, and I'm able to draw, as I say, almost as though this is a pencil, not a brush. But get these line angles right. The slope comes down across the wet sand here. And as I do this, I'm realizing that that's what this little painting needs more of, more line work. A little bit here. That's better. That's so much better. And I'm happy now because I'm back in sort of loose style painting territory. It was getting far too much in the sort of in the tight style. All I've got to be careful of now that I've found my new found success in this, is not to overdo it, is know when to put the brakes back on. So I won't do it all. I'll just do this section here in texture, leave those other sections either side less textured. But I can, you know, this is, nobody can teach you this particular area now that this is very arbitrary. It's something that you do over time. You get a feel for, and you'll get there much quicker if you just do it and not worry about it. If it's a bad painting, remember what I was saying earlier. You know, I always think when I'm practicing, I'll worry about the performance when I've got to put something in a gallery. Um, okay, so over here maybe a little extra depth, and I'm using the wrong brush. I'm quick enough to tell other people to use big brushes, so I should be practicing what I preach here. I'm picking up the same sort of dark mix, which is an ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, and a bit of burnt sienna. Now, what you've got to be careful of here is that you don't make this too boring looking. Even an edge like that should be broken up. Study the photo, you can see that it's basically what it is a line of trees at the water's edge, or at the landmass. That's much better too. So little shape in here in much the same way, indicating that that little area there is different to the area immediately in front of it. Excuse me. And I think it's time to do the boat and have done. Maybe there will be call for a shadow. So the boat, don't fuss with the boat. Ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. So let's pick up, I'll show you my little mini well here, my mini um, mixing palette. Ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, sticky. This is like um, epoxy glue. It's like araldite, you know, that two-part epoxy glue. I'm not sure whether so if I put the burnt sienna, now that I've made a generic dark mix with very little water, if I put a little bit of the burnt sienna to one side of this mini mix, and then I pick the ultramarine blue up and put it the other side, so effectively, even though the naked eye doesn't pick up on this terribly well, I know that this right-hand side is blue and cold, whereas this left-hand side is warm. Okay. Because the burnt sienna. Now, it's amazing. If you didn't do that and you just relied on one mix, you might as well be using black. And we all know, excuse me, sorry, we all know that black looks flat in our painting. So there's the front end of our little boat. Here's the gunnel, quite big, the gunnel, but dry. It's a dry brush technique, okay? You in real life, you probably wouldn't see a dark back vertical to it like that, but this is what we have to do sometimes to make our paintings work. There's a line there at the whatever that waterline area is that we put on our boats. So let's put some cerulean blue in on this boat hull. But first of all, and I suggest you watch this carefully, folks. That paint that I just painted, the outline shape of the boat, is a sticky, dark, rich paint. What I'm going to do now is place water carefully in the white unpainted area of the boat. That's the side of the boat. And there it sits. Okay. Now, it will of its own accord, in a moment, say hello to that sticky dark paint that's above it and below it. And that's what I want to happen. what I'll do in addition to that is pick up a little bit of cerulean blue, very small amount, hardly registers. Okay, move it about a little bit. And let's say, just to make sure that people can see it, we can add a little bit of yellow to it. So I'm using, although it's not on the list, forgive me, I'm using a little bit of cadmium yellow here. Okay, only because the other yellow that we have been using, which is raw sienna, is used elsewhere, and this won't look special as a result if I use the same yellow. So nice and watery. You've loaded the little boat with a lot of water, and then you've added a little bit of cerulean blue, and then to the front end here, you've also added a little bit of cadmium yellow. Now you could have gone cadmium red or cadmium orange. You'd find that I find that the red would sink a little bit because it's a darker color, whereas cadmium orange or cadmium yellow will stay rather more illuminated, brighter, more saturated looking. Um, I'm just going to put a little bit of dry brush across the water on the turn of the angle of the water of the river. Little indication there of some moving water. I'm now going to take a credit card. If you don't want to put a mast in freehand, like, you know, and I try to as much as I can, because after all, I have to keep these skills going. If you are going to do it my way, which is freehand, you need to load the rigger brush. I'm using ultramarine blue and burnt sienna with a bias towards the blue. I don't think we want a warm looking mast here. It's too far away. And this is how to do it free. This is how I do it freehand. I tend to start at the top of the mast and paint towards the boat rather than paint from the boat upwards. But, I've seen other people do it that way, and it works fine. It's what you get used to. But what you need to do is go in. Once you know the brush is loaded correctly, start where you think the top of that mast is, about here. Once you're close, once you know you're within half an inch of the surface of the paper, everything locks up. Your wrist locks up, your arm locks up. The only thing that moves is your fingers, like this. So here I go, much quicker than this normally, and it goes in like that. Okay, I'm going to show you the same with a credit card in a moment. Once that line's in there, you see, it's so much easier. When you can then say, well, it's not showing up terribly much because there wasn't much contact between brush on and paper. So I would just hit areas of that little mast and say, well, there's a little flag or a tag or something on top of it. There's another little line that comes down to the boat there. There's a mooring rope that goes down into the water, not across the sand so much. But here's the credit card trick. I have to show you my palette for this. So we've already got the plenty of paint there for this. It's nice and wet still. So I just push so much sweeping water out of a flooded room, God forbid. But it's like sweeping water across the floor. You know then that the edge of that card has got paint on it. And then it's a much easier job. If you want to go a little bit taller with this mask, place it carefully at the right angle. Don't, you've got to, what I was saying earlier, let me just do the mask first, and I'll explain what I mean. And then just run down your mask that way. So it can get a little bit messy sometimes with the card, but then I am using a slightly heavier textured paper. What I was going to say is this. The boat, the mast has to be perpendicular at right angles to the flatness of the boat. Now, boats will have deceptively look like they're sort of, it's difficult to sort of see the flatness of the deck inside the boat. But I would imagine the flatness of that particular boat is slightly angled up the beach like this. There's a slight right to left, right being the lower measurement and left going uphill. So it's like that. So that means your mast has to be at right angles to that. So I've estimated it already, as I've already painted in, as being about there. So it has to be right angles or perpendicular to that horizontal. If you were to go off to the right or off to the left, you're changing your there's conflict between what you've given us in terms of how the boat sits on the ground and what the mast is telling you. So make sure you get that right. Right, okay. Well, I'm going to just put a little bit more paraphernalia around this as I'm having fun. Perhaps we even give it a little flag up there or something, one little push of the brush like that. Now, I'm just going to put a quick glaze over some areas. So let's not call it shadow, okay? If everybody's sort of like, oh no, the shadows, no, I can't do shadows. Let's call it a glaze. Let me show you the palette. I could use what I've just been using, but it might be a bit mucky. So I'm just going to put a little bit of water in there. I'm going to clean it off. Doesn't have to be spotless. That's adequate. And now I'm going to pick up ultramarine blue. And because it's near the seaside, the coast, I always like to add a little bit of green into my glazes. So a little bit of viridian, just to make it more a marine-like blue. And then tiny bit of burnt sienna. So on this occasion, normally my shadow would include a bit of alizarin crimson from here, but not today. As I say, ultramarine blue, little bit of viridian green, and a little bit of burnt sienna. Make a lot of it, even though we're not using much. As I say, so this bit is all about creating the backlit, the silhouette effect. So let's say that area there is all, or mostly, I should say, mostly silhouetted or shaded from the light. So unlike my photo, which tells me there's a fair bit of light over here, so really it would have been more of a silhouette had we stayed there another half an hour to an hour and witnessed the sun going further down, and then all this would have been in silhouette. So you can see how, when we think we don't know how to paint something because we've never painted it before, all I'm doing is using a bit of practical knowledge of what happens. I have made mental notes when I've been there sometimes that's what's happening. We study it. I think we could get a little bit of this across this bank here like this. It's a rather nice effect, and particularly with this sort of color. See, neutrals don't have to be boring. Silhouettes and flat darks do not have to be boring. You can make them boring very easily by not using enough variance in your color mixes. If you just rely on one color for these, then they will be, unfortunately, rather flat and boring looking. So I'm going to pop up here, do a bit more of this. I don't want a hard edge on that. I need a soft edge and allow the tree branches to be the hard edge. Down here. Now this little mix is going to warm up a little bit more. So add for this area here a little bit more of the burnt sienna to it. So about here. Too much hard edge here, if you can see where I am. So I'm just going to scrub into that with my finger. When dare I say, shadows or glazes land on these vegetation, on organic matter like these bushes and trees, most of these edges should be soft anyway. Down here, and I think we're very nearly done. So it's funny, as soon as you do this, that now looks quite incongruous. So it has to be included in the plan. So a bit of dark with some gaps, and that's it. And I'll check. I may need just a couple up with this somehow, like that, even across there. It's something that we need to bring the two sides of the painting together. That was suddenly evident to me then. Yeah, yeah, okay. Um, right, and I'm going to spatter a tiny bit of white, and we've finished almost bang on time. This can be quite useful in these scenes. Um, so I take my white gouache, I take the paint with a clean brush and a dryish brush, yeah, dry brush. And I'll look at anywhere I think this will show up. So remember, we just put in some dark in the background against this mast. What if we put something on the mast? Could be just a piece of canvas strip or something like that. But we know because it's white on dark, it'll show up well there. A little hit on the gunnel there in the front. We could put a little round buoy, marker buoy, couldn't we? About here, and that's a mix of that white and yellow and red, red, cadmium yellow. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat today. So where else could we just? I think we'd just spatter a little bit of white around, and we'll be done. Maybe a white rigging, white rigging rope. Again, the thing to do here is play. The white is best. The best effect from this white is done where you're placing it over dark bits. So a slightly smaller spatter off this brush than the other brush. Could take some of this dry brush line across the wet of the sand in places over there. Just picking up, there are areas that have held onto a bit of the last tide or a bit of dampness there, still wet. And I think we're done. Okay, I'll just put a mount around it and we'll see the damage. Don't know whether it's good, don't know whether it's bad. I don't bother. I don't think about that. Sorry, I don't bother. I don't think about that. Now's the time I start thinking, is it any good? So, on that note, is it any good? Don't worry about it while you're painting it. Think about it only at the end. And that always puts you in that frame of mind that you're practicing. You're not performing, you're practicing. And you'll get your best work. Honestly, you'll get your best work if you can convince yourself all you're doing is practicing. So there, folks,